Hello, today we're going to be turning this empty glass into a miniature swamp aquarium, complete with some tiny little inhabitants. Let's get into it. To start off, we've got this empty glass that I got from the thrift store for $1. Its dimensions are about 4 inches tall, and about 3 inches across at the top, and it narrows down to 2 inches toward the bottom. Most of this build is going to be about the substrate since it's so small and we want to get a really good mix for this size of aquarium. We're beginning with a mix of used fluvial aqua soil and sand. We don't have a whole lot of plants in here, so we're just going to make there be a little bit more sand. This is the same stuff as was already mixed in. Next up, we're adding some fine white sand. This is just going to make our substrate a little bit lighter and make there be a little bit more contrast between that and the plants. After we give it a good stir, then we can move on to the leaves. What I'm using for today is leaves that fell off my apple tree in the backyard. I rinse them off to clean them and to remove any parasites that might be lurking on there. Now I can begin chopping it up really fine. After we scoop up our little brown french fries, we're going to make some mashed potatoes by smushing and ripping them apart into fine mush. We're going to stick this in the substrate and it will decompose over time and add more food for the inhabitants to feed on. We can stir these into the substrate mixture and then move on. Now we're going to jumpstart the tank with some extra algae. The inhabitants were adding feed off of algae, so this will allow us to put them in immediately without having to worry about them having a food source. We're starting off with this little algae wafer and breaking it up into tiny chunks. These are sold in groups at pretty much any fish store, but if you have a friend who keeps aquariums and has these, he would be more than willing to part with one of them for free. Heck, if you leave the tank long enough without any inhabitants, it'll grow algae by itself, so you don't even need these. Since the pieces are a little bit large as is, we're going to pour some water on them to help break them down. We will revisit these a couple times later on. For this video, we're going to have a really simple hardscape. We're just going to use one rosemary branch and a couple of small pebbles. I've already selected the rosemary branch I want and fit it to the size of the container, breaking off the ends of all of the twigs to make sure it fits. We're going to have some immersed growth in the top of the container, and for this I chose a jade plant, where you want to mount it on the top of the rosemary branch, so that way the leaves and stem are protruding above the water, while the roots remain immersed in the water, soaking up all of the delicious and yummy nutrients. To mount it, we're using Christmas tree wire. We're using pliers to cut off a large chunk. I noticed that there's a little gap at the bottom of this jade plant, which would be a perfect place to run the wire through it to mount it on the wood. So we do just that. We poke the wire through, then place the plant on top of the wood, wrap the wire around it several times after much struggling, and then we're good. I like to pinch the wire down on top of the plant gently, just to make sure it fits nice and snug and there's no wiggle room. Now for a test fit, we're going to place our completed hardscape structure back into the glass just to make sure everything fits just fine, there's no issues. Now, as promised, we're going to check back in on our soaking algae. It looks like right now they're still pretty hard and brittle, so we're going to give it a good shake and set it off to the side again. While we wait for this to soak, we're going to continue prepping for the next few steps. After showing off the gravel we're going to use here, I'm going to take some dirt, and this is just regular potting soil for my terrarium mix, and we're putting it in the substrate mixture. In most aquariums, you don't want to use this regular stuff, because it'll float up and into the water column and you get it all algae and nasty. Except this is a swamp, so we actually want this. Speaking of algae, let's check back in on our soaking wafers. Right now, they're a little bit softer, but they're still pretty hard and not quite ready for use, so we're going to set those aside until later. These are more of those apple leaves from earlier, prepared the same way. Except this time, we're going to chop them up into larger pieces, so that way they look like leaves still, because we're going to be putting them on top of the substrate. Now we get to add the substrate. We just pour it into the container, using pretty much all of it, and then pat it down so that way it's fairly level and shallow. Remember, we don't need a lot of nutrients in here, just enough for the couple plants we're adding. Now our algae wafers are almost done, but still not quite ready to add the larger chunks. The water is looking pretty nice and green though, so we pour that on top of the substrate, so that way it gets thoroughly soaked in. Then we're just going to add water, shake it, and then wait a little bit more before pouring it back in. Remember that pea gravel from earlier? Now we're going to scatter it across the top. We're not really planning the hardscape this one mostly, but having a little bit more variety on the ground makes it look a lot better. Now we're adding our leaf litter on top. I thought I could get away without boiling these this time, but I was wrong. I should have boiled them. They ended up floating later. So, boil them, they won't float. Continuing on our botanical theme, we're adding some alder cones. These are small decorative cones that release a lot of tannins into the water and make it look nice and yellowy. I also should have soaked these for a while, because these ended up floating later on, but fortunately I had a substitute, as you'll see later. Our algae is thoroughly soaked now, so we're just going to pour everything on top of our leaf litter. Now we plant the only underwater plants we're going to have in this entire build. This guppy grass in one of my tanks needs a trim up anyway, so we're going to cut off a couple of stems and plant them into the substrate in this tank. They'll eventually root by themselves and start growing into new plants. They'll need trimming pretty frequently because they're going to overgrow this little tank pretty fast, but that's a problem for future me. After we add the large algae chunks, I decide it's time to start filling up this tank. Always begin by pouring in water really slowly. I always recommend that you place a paper towel down over the top of anything, so when you pour the water in, it doesn't fling the substrate everywhere. But I forgot to do this at the start. It ended up turning out okay though. As you can see, the water is pretty cloudy, which is fine for a swamp, but what's not okay is all of this stuff is floating up to the top. We're gonna have to use a couple of substitutions for this. It's about now that I remembered I actually had some alder cones soaking from a couple of months ago, and you can see just how much tannins they had in them. After I completely failed to perform a siphon twice, then we wipe off the glass to remove all of the ugly foam and start pouring in the tannin water to get that gorgeous yellowy swamp color. Then we top off our nature latte with some regular water. Also, we quickly pick off any of the floating stuff off the surface. And now we finally place in our wood structure for the final time. It takes a little bit of wiggling and pushing to get the sticks to go through the substrate, but eventually we get there. Now we fill it up the rest of the way, just to make sure the plant's roots can reach the water. And now we can go get our inhabitants. The creature I've chosen for this build is Daphnia. They are tiny little bugs that swim around in the water and eat algae. We started an accidental culture here in the windowsill while we were trying to grow lettuce, so I wanted to give these guys a new home. So here's the game plan. We've got the culture, this tube, and the container we're going to put them in. The idea is we're going to use the tube to suck them up like a straw and then drop them into the container. Let's see how well we do. Alright, we caught a bunch of them and it didn't even get any in my mouth once. We've only got a little bit of the water, but you can see just how dense their population was in that one little container. Now it's finally time to release them. Here we go.